Welcome to the Juta Shoes DIY shoemaking video, where we'll show you how to make your own espadrilles. First, here's what's in your kit. You have 2 patterns in the material of your choosing, 2 back pieces and 2 front pieces. You also have 2 soles in the size of your choosing, a pack of pins, some leather needles, and some waxed linen thread. You'll also need a pair of scissors and a pair of pliers. You can use any pair of pliers you might have for home use. You'll need them to give you a little extra grip on the needle. Please take care when using the pins and the needles, as they are sharp and you can prick yourself. The first step is to pin the material to the sole. You'll need one of the front patterns, one of the back patterns, one of the soles, and the pins. The patterns are totally reversible, so you don't have to worry about whether you have the right or the left. With the heel of the shoe facing towards you, take the back piece of the pattern and lay it over the sole with the point facing down. You're aiming to line up that point, which is in the middle of the pattern, with the center point on the heel of the sole. Take one pin and pin the center of the material to the sole. There are 2 things you want to look out for when pinning. The first is that the material is right up against the edge of the sole, not overlapping over the edge or slipping inside. The second thing is that each pin points towards the middle of the sole, all the way around the edge. This is because if you place a pin pointing away from the center of the sole, you have sharp ends sticking out that you can catch your fingers on. Now that you have your center pin, you can start pinning around the edges of the back. Keep placing the material right up against the edge of the sole and pinning towards the middle, moving around each side. Do the same on the other side. If you'd like to use a thimble at any point on your finger to help push the pins in, feel free. The inside of the foot can be slightly trickier as the sole is curved, but as long as you keep laying the material against the edge of the sole and place as many pins as you like to keep the material in place, you'll be able to work it around. Now we can start pinning the front. With the toe facing you, take the front pattern and fold it in half to find the center. Then find the center of the sole, which can be traced from the circles of jute down the middle. It can take a few tries to find the exact center, so we'll guess and check. Place the center of the material on the center of the sole and put in a pin, always pushing towards the middle of the sole. Now do the same as you did with the back, going around one side and pinning the material right up against the edge of the sole. When you get to the part where the 2 layers overlap, place a pin that goes through both layers. Then you can remove the pin below if you like. It's important that the new pin you place goes through both the front and the back material, so that you don't lose the lower layer when you're sewing. now pin around the other side of the front, still keeping the material at the edge of the sole and pinning inwards. Again, when you get to the overlap, you can pin through both layers and take out the bottom layer of pins if you wish. Now for a troubleshooting tip. If you have a look at the shoe we've just pinned, you can see that the front pattern isn't quite even. The bottom points don't line up. This means we haven't estimated the center of our sole at the front correctly, so we'll need to adjust where we've pinned the material. We take out the pins along the side, leaving in the pin at the center top. We need to move the material around, so we take out the pin and move it around, and then replace it. We can then check to see if our material looks like it's in a good place. If it's not, we can move it again. When our ends look even, we can start pinning around again. If you've taken out the bottom layer of pins from your back material, you can put them back in at this point to help make sure you pin down both layers again. Check to make sure the ends of the front pattern line up. When they do, you've finished pinning your shoe, and it should start to look like an espadrille. Step 2 is sewing your shoe. For this stage, you'll need your pinned shoe, your waxed linen thread, and one of your leather needles. You'll also use your pliers for this stage. For each shoe, you'll need between 2 and 3 meters of thread, depending on how large a size you're sewing. The first step is to thread the needle. It's easiest if you hold the thread very close to the end between your finger and thumb, but if you're struggling with this, you can use a needle threader that you can find at any craft store. Pull the thread through the needle so that one end is just longer than the other. Place a double knot in the end of the longer thread by making one knot, and then making a second knot with the first knot inside it. Cut off any excess thread. Now we'll start the first stitch, which goes on the outside of the shoe where the front and the back overlap. The first stitch is different to every other. We send our needle between the 2 layers of material and come up into the top one. We want to aim to be about 1 centimeter away from the edge of the material, so you can play around with where the needle looks like it's coming out. To push the needle through the leather, you can use your fingers or use the surface you're sewing on to push upwards, Or you can use your pliers to push from the base of the needle upwards and pull upwards from the top of the needle. Make sure that you hold down the material when you pull up so the pins don't come out. If using pliers, try to grip as close to the middle of the needle as possible to avoid bending or breaking it, but don't worry if you do, we've given you a few replacements. Pull the thread all the way through so the knot tucks in between the two layers. Now we're ready to start the real stitching using blanket stitch. Holding the thread up towards the center of the shoe, take your needle and have a look at the sole. We want to place our needle in at the halfway point of the sole, which is marked by these lines. We want to keep coming out about 1 centimeter into the material, and we want to keep our stitches about 2 centimeters or a finger's width apart from each other. So for our first stitch, we'll put our needle in halfway down the sole and aim to come up 2 centimeters along from the first stitch and 1 centimeter into our material. You can use the table to push the needle up and pliers to pull the needle through, holding down the leather at the same time. It can take a little yank to pull the eye of the needle through the material. Now, as you pull the thread through, you'll see that because we held our thread up and out of the way, we've created a loop that we are pulling our needle through. This is the basis of blanket stitch, and as we pull tight, we'll see that it forms a right angle, which is characteristic of blanket stitch. We always want to pull our stitches tight towards the center of the sole so that we keep our stitching taut. Now we'll hold the thread up and out of the way again and do a second stitch, the same as the first. We place our needle in halfway down the line of the sole and aim to come up another 2 centimeters along. Because we are going through 2 layers of material here, it's twice as hard as the rest of the shoe. It'll get easier as you go along. Again, push the needle up and pull the needle out. As you pull the thread through, you might find that you haven't come up inside your own loop as we've done here, which we need for blanket stitch. So we need to place the loop of thread over the needle, or pull our needle up through the loop and pull tight to create the blanket stitch. Again, pull tight towards the center of the shoe, and you'll see that we have 2 right angle stitches. For our third stitch, we'll send the needle in halfway down the sole as before, and push it out 2 centimeters along from the previous stitch. Pull through with the pliers, and this time you'll see that again we're inside our own loop, so when we pull tight it will make the blanket stitch. We want to keep the tension tight along our stitches, so we can go back and tighten each stitch up by sliding the needle underneath and pulling tight. Now we continue stitching around, making sure each stitch has the needle coming up through the loop of thread and that we're pulling each stitch tight towards the center of the shoe. If you make a stitch where the needle isn't coming up through the loop of the thread, simply send the needle through the loop. So that when you pull it tight, you have another blanket stitch. Continue sewing in blanket stitch all around the front of the shoe. Now that you're only going through 1 layer of material, it should be easier to push the needle through. If you'd like to take out your pins as you go, feel free to remove them so the thread doesn't catch on them. Otherwise, you can wait to leave them to the end to take them out. Here are a few troubleshooting tips that might be helpful. Firstly, if you find that the thread gets caught when you're pulling it through, the long end may have become tangled. Pull the stitch out a bit and untangle the ends. Then it should pull through easily. Secondly, as you get to the inside of the shoe, you'll start to go through 2 layers again. Make sure that you're sending your needle through the bottom layer as well, so that you capture the back pattern in your sewing. You'll want to try to place a stitch in the corner at the end of the front pattern to hold it down. So you can start measuring out your stitches so you'll have space to land one there, and then send your needle up through both layers. As always, pull your stitch tight towards the center. Again, if you make a stitch that you pull through and see isn't inside that loop, you can simply send the needle towards you through the loop to create that blanket stitch. Our third troubleshooting tip comes in useful if you find that you have a tail end hanging out of a stitch. Simply pull either side of the thread to bring the tail through the stitch, and then shorten the hanging thread by moving the needle further down towards the end of the thread. Now it's time to finish your shoe. As you come around to where you started, again you want to measure out your stitches so that you can place one in the corner at the end of the front piece. With your last stitch, come up as close as you can to where your starting stitch came out, and pull tight. Now you're ready to finish. Before we tie off, we can take this chance to go around and tighten up any stitches that are loose. We want a nice clean line of blanket stitch all the way around the shoe, which only happens if every stitch is taut. To tighten, you can start from the first stitch, send your needle underneath and pull tight, going all the way around the shoe, tightening as you would tighten shoelaces. Once you're happy with your stitches, we can cast off. We want to make a knot to attach the first and last stitches together, so we send our needle underneath the first stitch, between the thread and the leather. Pull through gently, leaving a loop. You'll then send your needle through this loop to make a knot. Pull tight so that the knot sits on the intersection of the stitches. Now repeat so that you have a double knot. Now we send the needle in just behind the knot we've made, and we aim to come out halfway down the sole at the base of the last stitch. You can use the table to push and the pliers to pull the needle through. Pull the thread tight. Now we're going to make a second knot, sending our needle underneath the last stitch, between the thread and the sole. Pull through gently, leaving a loop, then send the needle through the loop to make a knot. Pull downwards, and now repeat to make a double knot. Our final move is to put our needle in behind this knot, and send it out anywhere in the rubber sole at the bottom of the shoe. You can push with the table or pliers again, and pull through with pliers. Pull the thread firmly tight, and then use scissors to cut it off as close to the sole as possible. If you haven't taken out your pins as you go, you can take them out now. And here is your finished, handmade, sustainable espadrille. Well done!